Not in the talking to myself mood today, but I had some ideas that I just got to get off my chest here. So that I'll start this thread with a conversation on YouTube, not on YouTube, on Twitter or whatever. And I was, going over, there was a very reasonable guy trying to debate me and trying to, basically, let's turn that up to that. Yeah, there was a guy basically, was trying to debate me on the Ukraine war, and I'm just telling him, look, I'm not rooting for anybody. I mean, I don't like our government in the United States. I don't really like Russia's government over there in, it doesn't seem to me like the Russian government is much better than the United States government, although we definitely have, it seems we have the fair share of incompetence between the two. But I didn't, I'm just telling the guy this is how it is, and Ukraine is losing, and by extension, the United States is losing, and this is going to be another, yet again, as I predicted on my YouTube channel. I didn't predict really the course of the war, right, or even the fact that they would invade, that the Russians would invade, but I did predict that no matter what happens, given the leadership in this country, which is obviously severely lacking. As a side note, at the G7, the U.S. delegation with Janet Yellen there comes up with all these cockamamie ideas, and the Europeans are like starting to question the competence of not just Biden, I imagine, but also Janet Yellen, which she deserves a fair share of criticism. I'm gonna get some water real quick, but I'll get water when I'm done talking about this specific thread. So, the United States has a fair share of incompetence and going on, and that reflects in even our upper level military. And so I was telling the guy, the United States looks really, but not only is Ukraine going to lose this and lose it bigly, the United States, it's going to reflect very poorly on the United States. Jacob Dreisand made a good point on the sidebar with Viva and Barnes and said that he made a lot of good points. That guy's really in tune with the machine. He's part of the machine, but he's like an unwilling participant of the machine. Jacob Dreisand, he's fantastic. So I think he was an intel guy or something, but just like like my dad, a military intelligence guy. But my dad was a lifer that was with special forces and all that. But this guy seemed like an intel kind of guy, very smart. He also says a lot of it is from being an immigrant, which I can relate to. But he said it's do or die time for NATO. Because what happened in Afghanistan was already a severe blow to NATO. Already. And 2 in a row is not going to look good, and people are going to start really questioning NATO's competence as well, and their ability to be to protect other countries from threats. And there's a lot of money riding on that, and so these people are going all in, more or less. These people in D.C. that are part of the whole security state regime, they're going all in, and Jacob Dreisand made this point, and they're just going to go all in. And he said something very astute, which was that they don't care how much it really hurts the American people. If the sanctions cause a lot of suffering, they don't care. To them, this is a fight for their existence as an organization, as an institution, and this is very true. So I also talked to this guy about the fact that, Ukraine is, he when I talked about how Ukraine was losing, he brought up and how Russia was winning. Let's say that I brought up how Russia was just destroying Ukraine, and it's readily apparent. Even the media's talking about that now, and how boomers actually watch that shit and still hold any value to it. It's beyond me. I think it's that generation is kind of fucked up. I don't know what's going on with them. But anyway, so NATO, back to NATO. Oh, I lost my train of thought already. Oh yeah, so I was telling him how Russia was just winning, and everybody knows it. Even the media is talking about it. And then I told him. He said he came back. He came back because I guess maybe he's a guy who likes history, but he obviously doesn't know much about history, or he doesn't know. Listen, he may know more than average, but I'm like a super nerd for this shit. But I love it, But he tried to make a good point, which was, well, the United States won all of the battles in Vietnam, most of the battles in Vietnam. So the government says, not really. But yeah, the United States won all of these battles. It at least appeared that we were kicking their ass, and that's true. Yet we still lost the war. And then I started getting back to him with, Karl von Clausewitz and the concept of the will to fight and how important that is, and how all the fighting age Ukrainian men, most of them left back starting in 2014 as the economy started to fall apart back then. And a lot of them fled when the war started. And there's press gangs right now in Ukraine where people are going door to door and detaining people and making them join the military. And and to think about how scary that is, think of this. The military brass over there is sending these kids, and now it appears people are saying there's a lot of middle-aged men among their ranks. They're sending them to literal suicide missions. When they're sending them to places that's what happened in Severodonetsk, because they sent thousands of troops to this untenable position they were trying to hold. They were going to lose it, and everybody knew it. And they sent several thousand men in there, and a lot of them died because when they got there, it was crazy. They all tried to flee, and the Russians hit them on the way back. I mean, they gave them a chance to surrender. So the Russians say that they give these Ukrainian troops a chance to surrender, but a lot of these people are probably pretty brainwashed over there, and especially, the whole connection with middle-aged men. I hear multiple people saying that the age of the Ukrainian army being encountered in the Donbass, by many accounts, are a lot more older men than you would expect. Maybe these are like older Gen Xers that are still hooked up to the cable brainwashing program over there in Ukraine, and to them, Zelensky's the best guy in the world because he was the guy on TV, right? That was the president. Then he became the president. How can that not be great to these fucking boomers over there? Boomers are the same everywhere, are they not? I know they are in Germany. I know boomers over there, and they really believe what they get fed on TV. It's crazy. So I wanted to go to Vietnam and talk about the concept, which the reason we won all these battles in Vietnam still lost the war is a very important concept. And people that don't have, aptitude in history or military history may not get this, but there is, successful wars tend to be wars with concrete objectives, and, then, depending on how lofty the objective is, that requires more brutality generally. So back in the medieval days when, the Mongols came across from the steppes and they came as a tsunami over the Persian Empire, they came with the intent of outright conquering the Persian Empire, which was Muslim at the time, but that was after the Muslims had already eradicated all the Zoroastrians out of Persia at that point. And here comes the Mongols, and they just commit genocide on the Muslims for not. I mean, they allow some people to surrender, some they just kill outright no matter what, and they basically committed. You couldn't call it genocide because it wasn't with the intent to wipe the Persians off the map, off the face of the earth, but it was definitely the brutality that was incurred at that time. We couldn't even imagine today. That's why the Mongols were so infamous, and how they grew their empire so large. When the United States attacked Vietnam, though, that's just one example of how objectives work. In Iraq, Persian Gulf War, we stuck to a limited set of objectives down to the time. We stayed approximately 2 days into it, and I think they had some contingency plan. The military planners set a limit. Well, the objectives are set starting in Washington, D.C., and then they're brought down to the generals, and then they came to a consensus. And there was many competent people there, even though, that's giving them actually a little bit too much praise. But there were some competent people there, and they put together a plan to liberate Kuwait. And then I think they had contingency plans upon contingency plans, and they used complex mathematics to model potential attrition and casualties and stuff. And that's really serious. And they had a limited set of objectives, which was simply one main objective, which was to liberate Kuwait. And they did that within, as we know, a few days, really. And they used a new form of warfare, really, that had never been really kind of displayed and fully to the world at that point, which was this precision bombs and stealth planes and hitting infrastructure and communications. But we have to understand, the civilians here in America aren't told about the civilian casualties, and there were civilian casualties in Iraq Part 1. In Persian Gulf War, although I'm not sure how many. I haven't looked into it. I don't think I think it's unreasonable, period, that we did that. But some people would say that's not like high civilian casualties. And then in Iraq Part 2, as we know, the civilian casualties were probably 1 million at least. But we had a limited set of objectives, and we won that war. So that we won that war handily because we set limited objectives. When was the last time we had real objectives that were realistic, plausible, and at least there could be a plan made to achieve all those objectives, starting at the strategic level, was World War II. In World War II, we had a clear set of objectives, which was to defend us from being outright conquered from a fascist country that was trying to take over the world, essentially. Things get more of course, things get more nuanced, much more nuanced than that. But we had a clear objective, and we had back to Karl von Clausewitz, our nation, the people of our nation, had a will to fight. They had a will to volunteer and go over there. Finding bodies wasn't a problem for the United States. Okay, and not in World War II. And we went and we had clear objectives. Not only at the strategic level, we're going to take, we got to go to the Ruhr Valley to cut off this industrial area, and they have really clear objectives. Then from the Ruhr River Valley, and we sweep it down, we sweep across the south because the British want to take the north, and the French kind of do something in the middle, but we defeated the army for them because the German army was already pretty weak at the time. That's what they don't teach a lot of people in U.S. history in the United States, is that the bulk of the German army was fighting the Soviets, and they were getting their asses kicked too at this point by the Soviets. And we were only getting we were getting a lot less resistance. We were fighting a lot less troops in the Western Front. Italy was a different story. Italy was kind of a really bad decision to even invade Italy, probably, but that was Churchill's idea. So, but we had clear objectives, and even at the tactical level, they're going to take this hill, and those are clear objectives. Everybody knows what they have to do. The officers know what their role needs to be, and there's no question. Everything is kept really simple, okay? And we won that war handily. And our people, even though I had to point out earlier that the United States had it easy relative to the Soviet Union. There were still a lot of young men, 100,000 probably just in the Western Front, something like that. I'm sure the Pacific Front had. I would think the Pacific Front would have had higher casualties, but I don't know. But I'd have to look that up because I don't know off the top of my head. But that was the last war that the United States fought. We had the World War II, where we had clear strategic goals. Now, Russia, today, fighting Ukraine, has a clear strategic goal. Clear strategic goals. Number one goal is to destroy the Ukrainian military. That is a clear objective, and that can be planned for very relatively simply, and it can be planned out very nicely, and they can have all the contingency plans they want, and it'll be great. And then they say to liberate the Donbass. We'll see how that turns out. I mean, I don't know why these countries will probably join Russia in all but name, at least. Crimea did outright. So that's what they want. If it's, legitimate referendum, that's what they want. Let them do it. That's the libertarian standpoint. But they got those two objectives, and that's really the main two objectives they set at the beginning of the war. As people who know what's going on there, as we know, it was clearly laid out. They said they didn't want to take over Ukraine. They wanted to just destroy the military and take over and whatever they want to do to Donbass. Donbass does not want to be a part of Ukraine anyway. But Ukraine, as we know, egged on by the United States, sacrificed itself for NATO. And it's really sad, but they don't have the will to fight. People aren't lining up to join the military there. The leadership is terrible. So Russia's going to win this war, and they're going to win it handily. And there's no way out of it now. I mean, there's no possibility of Ukraine. Ukraine put up a fierce resistance. I've said that before. Very fierce resistance. Now, one war that had no strategic goals. One more little military history tidbit. One war in which we had no clearly set strategic goals that really, it's much simpler because, our goals in Iraq and Afghanistan were fake goals. They just wanted to milk as much money out of it as they could. But obviously we were never going to win that war because they really didn't want to care if they won it or not. The people that are making the decisions up in D.C., they don't care if we actually won Afghanistan. They just wanted to milk it as long as possible. That should be just. There were some people within the military, however, that probably did want to conquer. Want to do like they thought nation building was possible. So as a side note, but there were no strategic goals in Afghanistan or Iraq and Vietnam especially. So Vietnam, basically the strategy was to bomb, first of all, to just carpet bomb northern Vietnam. Okay. Which would possibly work if that country had not already been carpet bombed several times before in the last, several times over. Throughout its, in the previous century of its existence. In the previous century of Vietnam's existence, they had almost continuous war for 100 years up until the Vietnam War, almost completely continuous. So they were already well adapted at that point. So the bombing raids, and they were getting supplied with all the weapons they needed from China and the Soviet Union. And so the weapons weren't a problem. And it was hard. A lot of northern Vietnamese died because of that. Civilians, we killed probably 1 million, but our government killed probably 1 million civilians at least. I know like what the official figure for the Vietnam War tends to be about 2 million Vietnamese died in total. I suspect that's much, much higher. None of these sorts of numbers are ever accurate. It's hard to even make an accurate tabulation of people who died in a war, especially in a country like Vietnam. But, and including today in Ukraine and with the Russians. You know, the Russians might be keeping tabs on it to some extent, but even probably the government has questions sometimes about soldiers missing and this and that. There's confusing things going on. Paperwork's getting messed up. So, you know, Vietnam had no we had the carpet bombing campaign, but no specific targets that would be of strategic importance, just industry, which, you know, bombs weren't so accurate then, and the United States government didn't care if they were accurate or not. And then there was the search and destroy for the ground forces. And so basically the whole ground operation came down to, the essence of it was they sent people out just kind of randomly or to places they suspected enemy forces were, and just went out there and looked for them and attempted to destroy them, or basically went out there and got themselves ambushed on purpose. Okay, and you know, success or failure was determined by the body count. They would count each confirmed kill they made, which actually there were, relative to how much fighting there was, confirmed kills were, I would say, uncommon, because in that environment it was hard, in the jungle, mountainous jungle, some of the roughest terrain to fight a war in the first place. In that kind of environment, it's difficult to tell if you killed anybody in a gunfight with military-grade weapons. Like the best weapons that the Soviets could provide went to the Vietnamese, and the United States had the best weapons on their end. We actually had some good weapons at the time. Not like it seems today. I don't know. It seems like so far the weapons seem to be a bit overpriced and a bit complicated. But so that was what passed for a strategy in Vietnam, in the Vietnam War. These randomly sending troops out and doing search and destroy missions. That is not a clear objective, and that's why, because first of all, there wasn't enough will to fight and to do what was necessary to actually, if we wanted to conquer Vietnam or at least destroy the Vietnamese NVA, the army, we would have had to go. If we would have focused more strategically and more tactically on taking out their army and doing whatever it takes, we would have done better. And also, of course, nobody in the population wanted to go to Vietnam, and they did a draft. And people didn't want to go. A lot of people, probably the majority of Americans, as we're getting towards 1968, 1969, the majority of Americans that are eligible for the draft, men, because women weren't drafted. I'm sure in the next Great War they will be. So, you know, don't get too anxious, women. You'll get your chance to get drafted soon, I think. But men, the majority of men who were of age did not want to go. So the will to fight wasn't there, and the politicians were not into it. And it was a lot of corruption, and Ukraine is the same situation. A lot of corruption in Ukraine. So I'm kind of going back and forth to Vietnam and World War II and comparing a well-fought war, and then Vietnam was a poorly fought war. Now we see who's not faring so well in the Ukraine war versus in the Ukraine war. the Ukrainians are not faring so well for a lot of the same reasons. Mostly, the Ukrainians have a clear objective, which is to reconquer the Donbass and make Donbass part of their country. But they don't have the will to fight because of the corruption. First of all, the corruption is bad enough to delegitimize the government to a large extent there. Okay? Whereas the government in Russia is stronger than ever. There's so many factors, but we can see how, like the search and destroy missions in the United States, in Iraq and Afghanistan, also kind of like no clear objectives. And here with Ukraine, the United States using Ukraine as a proxy seems to have no clear objective either. Because from the United States point of view, the objective seems to be to somehow weaken Russia by sacrificing an entire nation, including tens of thousands of lives, maybe more, of mostly young men. That's definitely not going to help Ukraine. So what is the United States objective? Just to, quote, bleed out Russia? It can't be at this point. So what's the objective? To achieve some sort of resolution that is the least politically damaging? That seems like the... But it's just so much corruption in the United States. You have governments you have different agencies working towards different ends. You have the CIA, State Department people that are being hawks in Ukraine and really very active in Ukraine from what I see. And then you have the Pentagon, which is kind of more on the fence. And the politicians, still most of them are rah Ukraine, but I see that determination, that resolution in their eyes, that resolve in their eyes is starting to diminish. And the United States really is fighting this war through Ukraine, and there's no clear objective. And Britain is heavily involved. It's not just the United States. The United States is the big boy on the block, but there's UK and then Germany. And there's no clear objectives whatsoever. So you can't win a war when there's no clear objective. Okay. The objective of the United States in this situation, and pulling the strings as they are, is not to reconquer Donbass or anything else out there. It's more like Vietnam. Just kill as many Russian soldiers as you can. But then you have, with no clear objectives, you can't have a real strategy, and the leadership suffers. If there was any good leadership in the first place, the leadership of the military really suffers with no clear objectives. So even if they had clear objectives, our leadership's really bad. That's another important aspect of military history. The thing is about it, and this is probably the way to conclude this. The thing is we can go through history right now. We can look at other relatively lopsided conflicts. If we look at the Romans versus some of the tribal nomads that were coming from the east and the north, relatively speaking, those are... That's a good... I'm going to think... And I got another Roman story, one of my favorite stories. But let's look at the barbarians and the Romans and the technological difference, and just the difference in the amount of power the two had. And the technological difference was significant, relatively speaking. We're talking about the Roman Empire, the most advanced empire in the world. To some of these barbarian people, it seemed like magic, and it seemed like some supernatural shit to them. The technology they had the only professional standing army of grizzled veterans, hundreds of over 100,000 of them at times. They had the best weapons, technology, supply lines, everything. They were like 100, 200, 300 years ahead of some of these barbarians. But by the 4th century of the empire's existence, they were getting their asses handed to them left and right. And they still had the same lopsided advantages, and they still lost. And so, you know, the problem with Rome was the corruption and lack of leadership, no consensus among the people. I mean, the Roman Empire at any given time in the 3rd and 4th centuries was split into several parts already. And then the Eastern Roman Empire finally split off for good and became the Byzantine Empire. But, you know, and one of my favorite stories, one of the most inspiring stories, really, to me, is the Great Jewish Revolt. And, I have a lot of respect for Jewish culture and the traditions and the history behind it. And I will go to Jerusalem someday. The Romans had a clear objective during the Great Jewish Revolt, and that was to basically by any means necessary, put down the Jewish revolt and force the people to submit to imperial rule. Okay, and the Jews at the time were, as they are now, very proud people and very proud of their traditions. And the Romans made the mistake of trying to force them to engage in Roman religious rituals. And the Romans even, it was fighting constantly. It was a buildup. It was fighting constantly for 30 or 40 years. This is around the time that Jesus Christ lived on this planet, okay? And so he would have lived in a very tumultuous time, much worse than now. It's absolute chaos. There's riots in Jerusalem, riots in Alexandria. It was just absolute chaos all the time. And Jesus was a revolutionary, really, is what he was. He was a revolutionary. And, the Romans obviously would have had an interest to put a man like that on the cross. And as we know, the Pharisees betrayed him. That's the story. So he lived in these times. In the Great Jewish Revolt, the little Jewish state, Judea, over the course of 2 years, from about the year 70 until the year 72, by most reckonings, they brought the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire almost failed to bring the Jews under control. The Jews started to become better organized. Not that they were really well organized, but better organized. And they really gave the Romans a run for their money. And considering the relative lopsidedness, supposedly, of competence, of everything to do with military factors, the Romans were a century ahead of the Jews and the Judeans, I should say, the Judeans, and they still almost lost. And very interesting. And what the Judeans had was the will to fight more than the Romans. And the Romans actually had some will to fight, but the Jews had a lot more will to fight because they were fighting for their very existence in their eyes. Because to them, being forced to do a state ritual, even if they tried to, at times the Romans made lots of concessions or tried to the Jews, but they were still a bridge too far for the Jews. And they said, well, we'll make it so that no, you don't really have to say you believe it, but you still have to take part in the ritual. That's our ritual. Everybody has to do it. If you don't do it, basically the Romans, in the Romans' eyes, it's like, first of all, they're like, who are these people that are telling us we can't make them do something? In their eyes, they were like, we rule the world. And secondly, they said from a standpoint just politically, we can't allow them to do that because then other countries, other subjects around the world will want to get concessions like that, and then the whole thing falls apart. So the Romans are like, absolutely not. You have to do it. We'll make concessions. The Jews said no, because that was their existence, their tradition, their God, which they believed strongly in. In the ancient times, this would have been a much bigger deal than now, obviously. So, and they almost brought the Romans to their knees. I mean, they put up a fight, a hell of a fight. It lasted 2 years. The siege of Masada. The siege of Masada today, which is the one where they held out on the top of this perfectly defendable fortress on top of this plateau. They held out for a while. The Romans eventually just built a huge ramp out of earth on the side of the mountain, which is still there. And all of them, supposedly, the story goes, is that they killed themselves. They all killed themselves. Now, this is history we're talking about. And some events are controversial just because you have conflicting accounts, okay? And this is also controversial because, the Jews feel that this shouldn't be celebrated, the fact that they killed themselves, or the fact that just one guy supposedly killed himself. Everybody else was allowed to kill each other. One guy had to kill himself. Rather than surrender, though, it was over 1,000 people in that garrison, and the story is they all killed themselves. Now, that is will to fight. And the Romans still beat them, but I think there were some concessions the Romans had to make. And they had to really work hard to keep Judea for a while under their control. So this whole thing with Ukraine, in closing, and Russia, just teaches us about those two factors, those important factors, which is the will to fight and how having clear strategic goals are of the utmost importance. And another thing I bring up a lot, just as a side note, which I've mentioned here, though, which I just mentioned, is leadership, which goes to will to fight and strategic goals, and all of them work together. And there's other factors, and manpower is a factor, and technology is a factor, and there's just terrain is a factor, and there's so many factors. But if we really study and look at history, we see more often than not, leadership can trump technology, will to fight can trump technology, and manpower even. Both of those, leadership, will to fight, and clear goals are just, generally speaking, if most wars involve two parties that have clear strategic goals. It's just that the United States lately has been getting into this habit, and it needs to get out. It's probably too late at this point. Maybe the whole machine is falling apart. I talk about that a lot. So if that's happening, then that's probably for the best in the long run. So, but the United States lately has been getting into situations where they have no clear strategic objectives. Iraq, Afghanistan, those were kind of a grift. But with this Ukraine thing, you have just a complete mess in Washington, D.C., as I mentioned. People just having agencies basically interfering with each other, conflicting with each other, and competing with each other, and having different agendas that are not compatible, and thus no strategic goals. The leadership sucks in this country, and that goes into a deeper issue that I can maybe put that out on video some other time. Ukraine doesn't have the will to fight. Certainly the population of the United States has no desire to fight. And, there's people in the world that understand all this stuff much better than me. And but I think, one issue that I'll probably get into elsewhere is our country is run by people who, too many people who have benefited from nepotism and are not there based on merit for other reasons, but mostly I would say because of nepotism, or people that, went to college together, all that. So we're lacking in talent, you know. So it's a very poor situation. I think Americans, until it gets out of control, I don't think Americans will truly grasp some of the consequences can be to what's happening to our diplomatic reputation around the world, and our military reputation is suffering. A Ukrainian general said, I'll never forget this. I had to double take and look at it, but it was from a legitimate source. Maybe I'll find that real quick. Let's see what I think. It'll be hard to find, although I am using Ecosia, which seems a little bit better. Foreignpolicy.com. So I don't know much about that, but I've seen it. I think it's a kind of mainstream thing. I wonder how old this article is, though. January 21, 2022. Good call, whoever wrote this analysis. Samuel Charup and Scott Boston. Interesting. They made the call back then. So they're talking along those lines. I don't know. There was a report somewhere, and I'll end it in a minute. There was a report somewhere that some Ukrainian general was complaining about U.S. weapons being shit. Just the javelins, I think specifically, and the Stingers. And it's true. Statistically, they haven't been. I don't see any evidence that they've been extremely successful in altering the outcome of the war. I think, the foregone conclusion that Russia was going to roll over Ukraine in their own way. People point to how the United States took over countries really quick. Yeah, we did. We kind of took over Iraq in 2003, but was it really taken over? The next 10 years tells you that it wasn't taken over. And Russia doesn't want to take over Ukraine in the first place. They want to take over the parts in the east where everybody already wants to be part of Russia. So there you go. And the Ukrainians have lost. The Ukrainians have lost more territory already, and they're not getting it back because the Russians are already starting to open offices and administrative structures there and putting up their flag. So they've already lost more territory than the Russians really initially demanded, a lot more than the Russians initially demanded when the war set out. Russia set clear strategic objectives. And also, I think, I don't know if I mentioned it before, Russia has the will to fight. They see the proxies, the Ukraine being a proxy and an antagonistic proxy of the United States that is being openly antagonistic, getting weapons from U.S., Russia, Germany, UK, Germany, getting weapons from them, and Ukrainians using those weapons on the Russians. Obviously, if Russia was doing the same thing with Mexico, sending them weapons, either aiding a hostile regime, or if some people believe the U.S. had a lot to do with the regime in change in 2014. I haven't seen any smoking guns yet. People say it like it's all but certain. It is all but certain. But there's the video clip that everybody talks about with Victoria Nuland. She sounds like, she is pulling the strings in the regime change of 2014. However, nowhere has anybody, as far as I've seen, actually admitted any of these high rank. They never will admit it. So there's that. So Russia would do the same thing. You tell people that, and they never have an answer. If Russia was doing the same thing in Mexico, we would invade Mexico. And even as Mexico is now, by the way, it's funny. I don't think if the United States was to invade Mexico like around this time for any reason, given the disposition of the two countries. I don't think the United States could win. And the Mexicans would put up a good resistance and kick us out of there. And Mexicans are tough people. And the United States, these people that are drinking the Kool-Aid, what's really crazy is the people who are making the Kool-Aid up in Washington, D.C. with all this propaganda about the United States being, the most powerful military in the world. Nobody stands a chance against us. The people making that Kool-Aid, the people pushing that propaganda, a lot of them believe it themselves, and that's the craziest thing of all about this whole situation. So I don't think it stands a good chance of ending well for the United States, our diplomatic reputation, our economy. And, really, I say this a lot. You know whose fault this is? If we're going to blame somebody, it's the electorate's fault. The electorate, people can say all they want that elections are not legitimate, or Trump, boo-hoo, Trump lost the election, boo-hoo, now, I have to go around and say no, elections aren't legitimate. No, they are legitimate. The vast majority of them are legitimate. They may be able to manipulate single elections here and there that they find very important, and they do everything they can, and we know it. And I still think that it's possible that the United States electorate, I think it's quite possible that the United States electorate did legitimately elect Joe Biden. I do believe that the electorate is that stupid, and it's mostly, again, going back to the boomers, it's these boomers that are too insecure and to admit that they have been getting bamboozled with their media. They refuse to entertain it because it hurts their little egos, okay? And these are the main people that vote. Look at what happened in France. The boomers in France elected Macron, and the statistics are so lopsided. 70 to 80% were like above 55 years old. So, okay, so I think I've ranted enough. That was quite a rant, and I am going to go here and pee.